Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are once again in the European Parliament, which is in the heart of the European Union. And in today's programme, we're going to be discussing the aftermath of Israel's defensive war against Hamas in Gaza and what this means in terms of Israeli-EU relations. And in the programme today, I'm joined by Thomas Sandell, the founder and director of the European Coalition for Israel and the sponsor of this programme. So welcome, Thomas. And newly elected Branislav Skripek, MEP for Slovakia. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
And we also have Michal Wieler-Tal, who is newly appointed to the European Parliament from the Israeli Embassy here in Brussels. So welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Branislav, I just want to firstly congratulate you on your election to this Parliament in the election. So well done for winning a seat and becoming an MEP. Can you share something about how you got involved in politics and how your Christian faith has actually shaped your politics?
Yeah, that was very sudden step for me. I never expected that. I have to say that I never expect even to be a Christian. My parents in Czechoslovak socialist country, we used to have, they gave us in communist uprising, especially my mother. She was a kind of communist for career. She really tried to achieve something and she believed that. She's very sincere and nice lady, and she really believed very good communistic ideals of being good to everyone, and generally they are very similar to Christian ideas, but you know, we know there is in center point missing God. But she really believed that. My father, he was just an atheist. But generally they didn't manage even to put together their marriage, so they got divorced. I was 14 at the time, and it really shook my life in bad way. So I really spent the next couple of years in inner disaster, I would say. So that led me to a very bad rock scene, trying to get something which will heal my wounds. But generally that just shake my life terribly. So I was on the edge of criminal life and bad things. But I joined the Czechoslovak Socialist Army, and at the end of term, which was for 2 years, it was compulsory military service, I had enormous encounter with God. So in spite of 20 years of communist uprising, God had no problem to touch my heart immediately, and that was a very personal, very deep experience. And I realized there is God, He is good, and we can understand Him, and He speaks to us. So later I found out very alive and new Christians after finishing the military service. That was right after the revolution in Czechoslovakia. So I simply discovered very new world of Christian world of Christians, and I realized there is terrible differences amongst them, and there are people who just take it for, you know, as a burden for life, and the people who really respect God and they find very new way approach to society, to the life generally, to the world generally. And I decided that this is something. God gives a meaning for life. He gives you new values, and you can fight for so many good things, and the above all is love. So later on I became a leader of small Christian group. It grew up into a great movement. But generally I have to say that Christians don't understand they have in any way interfered with society or politics. And that was also my attitude. We prayed for society, for politics, for goodness, for good things to spread. We evangelized, but there was no way that I go into politics. So I became a preacher and evangelist. But last 3 years ago, we had our government fell for political problems, and there is a new political movement which wants to bring people who love the country to politics. And they just rang me and they said, would you like to join us? And I say, oh, this is something I didn't expect ever, never. But I learned from all the Christians that the highest thing is to obey God. So I said, if this is God's voice, I would go. So I prayed for 4 days and I got very clearance for, yes, go for it. So I became elected later to national parliament. And after 2 years, recently we had a campaign to EP elections. So I ran again after the prayers and the encouragement by my friends, and I got a mandate, which I, thanks to God and thanks to people, so nothing to congratulate me. I'm here, I didn't expect it.
We're glad you're here anyway, and thank you for telling us your testimony. And Michal, you've newly been appointed to be head of the Israeli mission to the European Parliament. Can you show us how you got involved in Israeli diplomacy and what it means for you to represent the nation of Israel here in the heart of the European Union, which is the European Parliament?
Okay, well, I started my diplomatic career about 13 years ago and have served in Asia. I've served in New Delhi, Seoul, and Tokyo, but I was always very interested in Europe, and this exposure was a very good chance for me to get to know the European side better. Of course, it's an honor for me to represent Israel in the EU Parliament, but it's, I think, a greater honor and challenge to understand the European relations with Israel. I mean, EU and Israel have shared its relations, and it has its ups and downs, but I think we enjoy the cooperation in the field of R&D with the Horizon 2020, a program which scientists and academics share knowledge and research and development. And we also share the aviation links with the Open Skies Agreement, which will be ratified by the year of 2018.
Excellent. So welcome to the programme. And Thomas, can you just give us a little bit of an update? I know that you had the privilege of being in Jerusalem last week, and you met with representatives, including the Speaker of the Israeli Knesset and the Prime Minister's office. Can you share, obviously you can't share everything, but can you share some of the important aspects of these meetings and where you feel the Israeli government is going and how we can help?
Thank you, Simon. Good to be back in the program. Good to be back in the European Parliament, I should say. We always start the new year. We consider, though we are Christians, we consider September to be the start of the new year because that's when people return from their holidays. We always do it in Jerusalem, not only because of the weather, but because we think it's proper protocol. And rightly so, we did have meetings in the Prime Minister's office. We met with the Speaker of the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein. We had meetings in the Foreign Ministry. And obviously there's a great concern in Jerusalem about how things are developing in Europe. We did speak about the crisis with Hamas. But I think the number one issue is really what is happening, what is developing in Europe. And the discussions we had were, of course, to see, well, how could we work together to make life sustainable for the Jewish community in Europe? You may recall the article of Nathan Sharansky a few months ago when he asked provocatively the question, is there a future for Jewish life in Europe? And I believe having witnessed the last few months with radicalized anti-Semitism here on the streets in Europe, these meetings are so important. A greeting, of course, from Jerusalem, from the government to the viewers, for everyone who do everything they can to be supportive of Israel and the Jewish people. This is very nice. Much appreciated, and I just wanted to convey that greeting as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. And Michal, it's been a very tough summer for Israel. I mean, it really started in June with the abduction and the brutal murder of 3 Israeli teenagers on their way home from school. Then we saw that Hamas launched over 260 rockets in one day, in which Israel then responded with Operation Protective Edge and also sent ground troops in. Can you describe what it's like for Israelis living under this constant rocket and missile threat, particularly knowing that in the recent conflict that 3.5 million Israelis were affected by these rockets and missiles?
Right. Well, I should correct you and say that 8 million people were affected because this campaign, counterterrorism campaign, was affecting the whole nation. I mean, there were families fleeing to the north away from these rockets. There were children trying to take cover under shelters, and they had only 15 seconds to do that. And the whole nation is traumatized by these missiles, which were not only coming from the north, from the south, they were also coming from the northern part of Israel. So it's been a living hell for the past 52 days. Israelis have lost their lives, and accordingly, they believe that there's no hope for some kind of agreement between the Hamas and a long-lasting ceasefire. I mean, for the past 14 years, the people of the south have been suffering from these rockets. Over 5,000 rockets have been launched in the past 14 years. So they don't really see any hope. And Hamas, in the recent campaign, Hamas has violated over 6 times a ceasefire. So what credibility do they have now for keeping this one?
That's a very good question. And that's where the international community can come in and play a greater role in ensuring that they actually keep to the ceasefire agreements and don't rebuild their terrorist infrastructure, particularly the terror tunnels and these rockets and missiles. Branislav, I mean, we've seen incredibly dramatic events shaping the Middle East really this summer, particularly with the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State in both Syria and Iraq. We've seen almost the ethnic cleansing of the Christians living in the north of Iraq, and also the Yazidi people who are on the verge of extinction, and Israel's terror war against the Islamist terrorist organization Hamas. What do you make of what we see now happening in the Middle East today?
This is terrible summer. This was terrible summer. To see all those shootings, all those movies taken by amateur journalists. On one hand, we have to say it's terrible expression, but it's good that we really can see in our very well fed Europe how the people are suffering, not how they suffering, but that they suffering, and to see the horrible scenes from the world, I mean the areas where they fight. So one thing I really realized immediately after seeing these things, these victims, they have their families, their mothers and fathers, or brothers, or wives, or husbands at home. It's terrible. So I really want to express my deep griefs to these people for the victims. And the only thing a normal person would think is, let's call for the cease of this. And with my newly discovered meaning of life, which is love and understanding God and respect God, the only my cry in my heart is the cry to God and prayer to God, because I believe one thing: God is able to change people's hearts, and this is pure hatred which comes out of the people who are able or willing to kill, to shoot others just because you don't agree with me. I mean, we never shall achieve in this world civilization our goals by guns. So this is the only thing what we can say. It's terrible to see, but we shall do everything to seize it.
Yeah. And Thomas, we've seen really the way that the media and the international community have essentially been obsessed with Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, and yet she launched that war in order to protect her citizens. We have to also understand the oppression that Hamas brings to the people of Gaza, using all the concrete, the missiles and rockets, which could be going into building schools and hospitals and what have you. In your opinion, why do you think that Israel's been singled out when we've already seen that Egypt and the United Arab Emirates have attacked Libya? We've seen the evacuation of the British and American embassies in Libya and virtually no news contact. There's been very little news coverage of what's been happening in Syria, the ongoing civil war, and it's only now that the media started to really pick up on what's happening in Iraq. Why do you believe that Israel's been singled out?
I think the question goes back to even more fundamental question. Why is it that the Jewish people are being singled out, have been singled out throughout the ages? And the answer for me is the same one as to the first question: anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, that we've been discussing so many times on this program, trying to analyze, to understand, still realizing it cannot be understood in a rational sense. because it's perfectly true, as you say, that we see these most horrendous images of people being butchered in the very same region. You would think, if you were a rational person, that immediately the next day you would see hundreds of thousands of people on the street of Europe protesting against this and say, well, this will have to come to an end. But we do not see that. To my knowledge, we've seen very, very, very few demonstrations. I'm aware of only one in the Nordic countries, in Stockholm, where you have a large community of Assyrians and people from the region. But by and large, if you compare that to what has happened, say, in Paris, in London, over the summer, and we've seen tens of thousands of people. I think there was one instance where there were 100,000 focusing on this conflict with Hamas. You just have to say that something doesn't add up. And when something doesn't add up in a continent where we pride ourselves of being people of the letters, you know, rational, sophisticated, I often go back to this very deadly virus of anti-Semitism. And we have to remind our journalists, we have to remind our political leaders time and time again that something is not correct. The accusing fingers are not being pointed in the right direction. And it's actually our responsibilities as citizens to raise these issues with our elected leaders, with the journalists, with the newspapers. And if we do it, and if we pray to God, as you said, I think anything can happen. And we shouldn't, having a Slovak member on the panel, we shouldn't forget what happened in 1989, that the unbelievable could suddenly happen when the time was right and when the people did their share.
No, absolutely. And Michal, we know that Israel launched its ground offensive known as Operation Protective Edge, and that many brave and courageous Israeli soldiers have lost their lives in defending and protecting the nation of Israel. Firstly, what were the political and also the military objectives of this war? And secondly, what role can the EU do in ensuring that the ceasefire lasts and that we don't see an escalation of the conflict, but we see that actually pressures placed upon the government of Hamas to actually look after the interests of the people rather than the interests of their own evil ideology?
Mm-hmm. Well, Israel has launched a counterterrorism campaign against Hamas. And although the aim was to weaken the Hamas organization, unless it will be demilitarized, unless Gaza will be demilitarized and Hamas will be dismantled of its weapons, we cannot see in the coming future a change. And this is the aim, and hopefully this will be developing into something new that we've not seen before, but it's really up to whatever is developing in Cairo, whatever happens in Cairo once negotiations or talks will start. Hamas has always charted the elimination of Israel. So trying to get that out of their ideology would be very hard. At the time, once there's a mechanism which will dismantle Hamas from its weapons, only then will other allies and friends of Israel would be able to contribute to that.
Yeah, but what can the EU do? What do you want the EU to do? In terms of policies, in terms of statements, to ensure that we don't see an escalation again in a couple of weeks or a couple of months by Hamas in terms of the ceasefire agreement, and ensuring that, for example, I know the EU plays a tremendous role in helping the people of Gaza, but we have to make sure, don't we, that Hamas is not allowed to build up its military and terrorist infrastructure again.
Right. So, as I said, first of all, support the ceasefire. Give all the good reason why this should be kept, and civilians will not be hurt over and over again on both sides. And of course, once there's the mechanism, then we can think of a very more practical contribution. Because at the moment, it's just a level of talks, and how we can progress into something that's more feasible or tangible.
And Michal, you have such an important and significant role here in the European Parliament, not only to give Christians a voice, and I'm sure that you're going to go on and be an incredible leader inspiring so many Christians around Europe to get involved. So I do believe very much that your appointment is a God-appointed appointment for this place. But in terms of how other MEPs and those who have a passion and love for Israel, how can MEPs like you stand up for Israel in what we're seeing is an increasingly hostile environment towards Israel and the Jewish people, even here in the European Parliament?
The great question is why. My question is why. I mean, why any one of us, believer or not, is or have to create any hatred towards others. We have to simply respect each other. But this is not an unknown phrase. This is not unfamiliar. This phrase goes around in the mouth of politics so many times, wherever in the world. But Europe simply proclaimed in the Lisbon Treaty, in our greatest document, that we would not mention God, even mention God. We don't even speak about any respect towards God. So I don't think we can expect good things on the earth without respecting there is someone above us. So how many times, how much politicians speak about peace, goodness, good financial systems, being happy, being fine. We speak about everything, all the good things, but we try to focus on ourselves to create those good things. I simply have to say, and I stress again, I used to be an atheist. I was educated, or I grew up as someone who was given all the good things, as much as it was possible, without any mention of God. But it didn't bring peace, it didn't bring goodness, it didn't bring all those things we really like to have. And if the nations would deny this, that there is someone who can give what we try to get, someone bigger than us, we never will get it. So in the Bible, it's written that if a man respect God, he would be blessed. That means he would be given good things, what he needs. But I have to say also one thing. So much I know Israel nation and its history. Nowadays also this nation secularize itself and says, okay, all those nice religious things, good for history, probably not too much for us. I know there are groups of people who are strong believers, but also generally, hardly we can say this is a nation of believers, people who happily would respect God. And I think if any nation says, we don't need you, God, we cannot expect good things on earth. So we call for ceasefire, we call for goodness, we call for whatever nice, what we really like to see, but what we see, the most horrible scenes of butchering people, as you said. So, have a look, Israel is not my neighbor. Iraq is not my neighbor, I mean, in the geographical terms, but I do care. I think it's important that we will stress these ethical values much more. But my question is anyone calling, are spiritual leaders calling people to pray, to gather, and to show up, to repent? I don't think these phrases are even popular. And I don't think here in European Parliament we shall neglect themes like this, or we shall just avoid it. And I am here really to say, I really want to say, if I would be in whatever way diminished, no problem to me, because this is the main point thing, to say we cannot disrespect God. We have to say we respect you, God, and we expect that you will help us and change what we need to change.
Yeah, Thomas.
Can I just add, appreciate what Branislav just mentioned. If we go back to the debate around the Lisbon Treaty, it is true that there was no mentioning of what we would call the Judeo-Christian heritage. And I think it's significant for a number of reasons, but also that once you mention explicitly, you just tell things the way they are, that Europe became Europe because of the infusion from Jewish culture. Europe could not be Europe if it wasn't for Jerusalem. There would be no reference point. And, but I think if we would have managed to get this mentioning in the treaty, it would also cement in a natural way the relations between Israel and Europe, which goes back not only one generation or two generations, but it goes back to its very foundation. And I believe this is important today for us to say. And we see, if you go to Israel, and like the former president in Spain, Aznar, would say that this is the frontier for the Western world. If Israel fails, we all fail. Because when you go on the other side of that border and you see what is happening in northern Iraq right now, to give an example, you see this is the complete opposite of the Judeo-Christian civilization, the way it has developed over the last 2,000 years or longer. And therefore, I believe, and I wish you all luck to bring this issue back in the debate in Europe, to say that we need values in order to stand strong.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that we have to understand where European cultures come from, and it comes from our Judean Christian heritage, and that's why Israel is so important, because Israel is on that front line. Israel is part of our heritage. The Jewish people gave us the 10 Commandments, which is our moral code, and we know that God has a special purpose for Israel and the Jewish people today, and that's why we're here in the studio. Michal, probably one of the greatest successes of the modern state of Israel has been to provide a sanctuary for Jewish communities across the world to have a safe haven. Prior to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, there was no Jewish home for the Jewish people to flee. Had there been, prior to World War II, I'm sure that millions of Jews would have been rescued and saved. But now there is a State of Israel that protects and looks after the interests of the Jewish people, provides a safe haven from anti-Semitism. Are you concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Europe and how that actually affects European Jewry? There's a recent opinion poll in London, for example, that said amongst British Jews that 63% of British Jews do not feel safe in Britain anymore and are looking to flee. Is the rise of anti-Semitism affecting Israeli-EU relations? And in your opinion, what can be done to confront anti-Semitism here in Europe?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are two phenomena which are currently going on. One is anti-Semitism, and the other one is anti-Israel sentiments. And there's a very common tendency to mix between the two, because the linkage is very problematic. Sometimes things that are happening in Israel with the conflict or the peace process are reflecting on Europe, and people don't really understand what is the difference. So there is a there's a problem with the linkage between anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli sentiments, and I think it is up to the local governments to stop these phenomena and to denounce it, because they're very dangerous, and it feels like history's, we're going back in history. I am glad to say that there is a working group with the EU, and it's an annual working group, which is a seminar on anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. So this seminar is taking care of these phenomena, and the issues are rising within this kind of a framework. So something is being done.
Yeah. And Branislav, this new parliament, I believe, because of this conflict, we're going to see an increase in pressures against Israel. We're going to see hearts changed and more hostile and more negative towards Israel, particularly with the rise of boycotts, divestments and sanctions. We're already seeing the EU guidelines as a form of bringing economic sanctions against Israel on behalf of the EU. So in your opinion, what can be done here in the European Union to raise up a voice to defend Israel?
So I hope you said, I certainly believe that this would come that even more anti-Semitism will come, but I say let's hope and let's show up not. let's speak against that. But we shall say that any hatred or any anti-whatever it would be can be defended, can be destroyed by law. We have to find in ourselves a willingness, and there is one word: reconciliation. Reconciliation. I think politicians and spiritual leaders have to challenge nations to think about others in more nice way. Simply as simple as it sounds. We have to simply say to people, don't be enemies to each other. We are here not to destroy each other. We are here to cooperate and to be nice, at least nice to each other. But the only thing, the real core of everything is hatred flamed by wrong religious understanding. I have to say that out of authentic Islam, if the core message is taken away, only terrorism remains. Out of authentic Christianity, if the core message is taken away, stays only nice phrases or focusing on very false admiration to God and focusing on ourselves. So in Europe, what we did in Europe, we focused on borrowing money and whipping up the luxurious life. The result is ego, and ego is always focused on itself and does not focus on others. The long results are hatreds. And also here in EP, if, as you say, we can expect something against anti-Semitism, against others, it still grows up from our egos. So I think at least we have to challenge people to destroy this in us. We have to more speak about ethical values. Because we neglected that, we have the results. I think we need to become more ethical.
Yeah, Thomas, we're down to the last 3 minutes. So this is a critical time for Israel. This is a very, very critical time for the Jewish communities across Europe who feel under siege. And now's the time to speak up. What practical measures can you suggest, particularly to our viewers, that they can get involved with in defending Israel and get involved in politics?
I think it's very important that everyone who is watching the program understands that they are just as powerful as anyone else. The beauty of democracy is that people only have one vote. Regardless of how rich you are, you don't have 2 votes or 3 votes. So we should never neglect the power of one. You can make a difference. You can make a difference by using your rights in a democratic society, by calling your local member of European Parliament and National Parliament, expressing your concern in your own language. You don't have to be an academic to get your message across. This person will have to be re-elected and he gets what you're saying. You can speak up, of course, in daily life, at your workplace, when discussions is going in the wrong direction, when Israel or the Jewish people are being blamed. You can write a letter to the editor and make your points heard. And I think the worst thing that could happen would be to give up, that we would feel that this is something that we cannot stop, it's just coming against us. The good news is that we can do something, we can stop it. Things doesn't have to be repeated. We can shape our future in a different way in Europe this time. That's why our organization, European Coalition for Israel, is there to give a voice to Christians from across Europe, here in this parliament, at the United Nations, in national governments. And I think where there is a will, there is a way. And we both have a will and a way. And I think, just as you said, Branislav, that we will just have to pray and hope that the situation will change and that Israel and the Jewish people will be appreciated for what they are and what they contribute.
Yeah. And finally, I'll let you have the final say, Michal. Firstly, on behalf of us involved with the European Coalition for Israel and also my channel, Revelation TV, that our heart goes out to the Jewish people, it goes out to Israel, that we're standing with you, we're supporting you.
Thank you.
But what can we do to help support you more, to put your case forward, to give you that political representation here in our national parliaments across Europe, and to reassure you that you're not alone and we're standing with you?
Well, I think you're already doing that, and that's echoing out Israel's righteous case to defend itself, to defend its civil population against all these terrorist attacks and extreme Islamic groups who are planning to eliminate Israel. So you are already doing it, and I really, really thank you for it. The European Coalition for Israel is creating seminars and briefings, information, document papers, filled with information of the real Israel. And I think this is what it's all about, letting people get the information, allowing them access to know the real Israel and what we stand for. So you're already doing it, and I think sometimes even better than us. So thank you very much.
And I want to thank you all for watching today's European report here from the European Parliament in Brussels, and it's important that we do all that we can to confront what we're seeing today is a rise of anti-Semitism across Europe. We need to tell our European leaders and our MEPs and our political representatives of the dangers and the feelings that the Jewish communities across Europe are feeling under siege at the moment with this rise of anti-Semitism. And so thank you for watching today's European report.